I want to start by talking a little bit about something that was popular when I was in high school. You may remember it. It was 2 weeks ago. It was a little longer than that. I graduated in 2005, and from about 2000 to 2005, the entire youth group would go to a big church event called Winterfest in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And we would take over Gatlinburg, which was only kind of impressive because it was February and not as many people in Gatlinburg in February, but it was still a bunch of people. And all the stores in Gatlinburg, I don't know what they sell when there's not a youth event there, because it was all swapped out for novelty Christian t-shirts. I am convinced that I grew up in the golden age of novelty Christian t-shirts. I imagine they are made, these t-shirts take a popular brand or ad campaign, and somehow I imagine some sort of crack team of youth pastors that can't get a job in ministry for pun-related reasons are working and designing these. This was before you could, post all your memes to Facebook, so you had to wear them around everywhere you went. Just a few examples. This one was one of the more popular ones. Abercrombie and Fitch, very popular when I was in high school. But did you have a breadcrumb and fish? Oh, we did. We actually had someone wearing the kind of sister shirt to the next shirt that is, "Relish, sweet Jesus." There was a huge commotion when I did this at first service, and a lady stood up and she had a "Ketchup with Jesus" shirt on, and so we had a pretty good laugh about that. So these shirts are made, they're a little kitschy. They're not that useful for ministry, but they're kind of fun. They're really there so that at church events, you can have youth group members with some disposable income buy a shirt for $15. And one person, thank you, Joe. But there's one that always bugged me. Most of them I'm fine with. They're a little silly, but I'm fine with it. There's one that always bugged me. "Jesus is my homeboy." I'm sorry if you had a "Jesus is my homeboy" shirt. At the receiving line in first service, someone said, "I thought you were going to, kind of Superman your shirt open and be wearing the shirt." And I'm like, no, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen with any time I preach. But I could talk a lot about this shirt. You'd get really bored, but I could. I could talk about how flippantly it kind of expresses the most important relationship of our life. We could talk about how it seems to leave out the sacrifice of Jesus and just make him, Jesus is someone I hang out with. But the things that bug me is that it was most often church people that were wearing this shirt. And the church people that wore this shirt, from what I could see, were people a lot like me that hung out with people that were a lot like me. And as I read the Gospels, and I read who Jesus hung out around, I didn't know if I wanted to hang out around all of them. As Barry has pointed out the last few weeks, this is not how Jesus operated. He didn't hang out with the in crowd. He was not one of the gatekeepers to being a part of the group. He sought out and cared for the nobodies, for those on the sides, those cast out, the ignored, and the unaccepted most readily got the attention of Jesus. Now, that's not to say that church people didn't get Jesus' attention. They just didn't do much with it, to be real honest. Everywhere Jesus goes, every time he cares for one of the cast out, there are the church people kind of on the sidelines. Right? Like, they're following Jesus too. They're the Pharisees. They're the Sadducees, the teachers of the religious law, the scribes. They didn't so much listen as they asked questions. They tried to trap him. Their pride in their accomplishments, their social station, all of that kept them from seeing how much they needed Jesus. They followed Jesus, but they never followed his example. Jesus talked with them, but very, very rarely could he make disciples out of them. But nobodies. God can work with nobodies. Whenever Jesus encounters a nobody, they leave sharing and rejoicing their experience with Christ, regardless of what Jesus tells them to do. Most of the time when Jesus heals someone, he says, "Now don't tell anyone, it's not the right time." And they go off, and what do? It's like all of Israel is populated with toddlers. I have a 3-year-old. You just watch them, you say, don't touch that, you do something, and what are they doing? Thank you. Get a little bit of my life in there right now. I don't think they were really all toddlers. But they're excited. We saw it with the shepherds, who were the first people to hold little baby Jesus outside of Mary's family. And it says the next day they went out and they told the entire city of Bethlehem that the Messiah had been born. We saw it with the blind man begging outside the gate, who's told that he was not made blind because of sin, but he was made blind so that he could share the good news. And then he runs and shares the good news once he regains his sight. We saw it with the leper. And Jesus swapped places, touching the untouchable, becoming unclean himself, so that the untouchable could rejoin the community and be clean again. And we see it very clearly with Jesus' closest followers, his homeboys, if you will, the apostles. Many of the apostles shared a common occupation. Simon was one of them. They were fishermen. This is not a job people wanted. We think of fishing as relaxing. It can be fun. You're out in nature. But this meant, in Jesus' time, that you dropped out. You'd failed out of school if you were a fisherman. Because this is not a job people wanted. You'd had the basic education that everyone got. And then when it came time to, say, train under a rabbi or go to the next step in that education, they said, you know what? You're not making the cut. They're a member of the Amharats that Barry mentioned, and that's just such a fun word, I had to say it. They're a member of the Amharats, the people of the land, the people that did the hard jobs that were kind of ignored and overlooked. They did dirty, stinky, back-breaking, dangerous work. The best case scenario for a fisherman was that you go out in your boat. Maybe you went out in the day when the sun is beating down on you with only the sail for shade. Maybe you went out at night when it was a little cooler. But the best you could hope for was casting out your net, getting a lot of fish to swim in it, straining your back as you as your friend pull it up, and then you get to spend the rest of your day in a boat with stinky fish. Or the rest of your night in a boat with stinky fish. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is you are out all day or all night fishing and you come up with nothing. Because then you have to wonder, how am I going to feed my family? How am I going to sustain my livelihood? What does this mean for the people around me that need something to eat? It's after a night like this that Jesus comes up to the apostles, and Jesus is getting crowded around the shore. So he takes a step back and goes up to the apostles or to Simon and his friends, not apostles yet, spoiler alert, who are cleaning their nets. They're done for the day. They haven't caught anything. They're done for the night. And he says, could you put out a little way from shore so that I can teach the crowds that have gathered around the bank? Simon agrees. But before they come back in, Jesus has a request. He says, put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch. Peter answered, Master, we've worked all night long but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets. When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And when they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell at Jesus' knees, saying, Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish they had taken him. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching people. Most translations use fishers of men because it's a little less creepy. When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed Jesus. So Jesus begins by giving Simon, or you may have noticed he's also called Peter, what seems like a really dumb idea. Hey, let's go fishing. He's like, we just got back from fishing. We were cleaning our nets. I was about to turn the key and close up shop. I am very tired. I have been out all night. I caught nothing. Oh, well, have you tried the other side of the boat? Come on. Simon Peter could have said, you know what, you know your theology, you're a great speaker, you're a good teacher, but you don't know fishing, okay? You don't know fishing like I know fishing. Listen, you may have gone to that fancy school, but you don't know fishing like I do. He could have puffed himself up. He could have been a little prideful there. He responds, though, with obedience, humility, a little talk back, but we're only human. And what happens is he pulls in a huge haul, so big that they need the other boats to come and help. Simon Peter and his partners gain two things from this experience. The first thing is fish. The second thing is an epiphany. Peter was always willing to be the first person to say something. He was always willing to be wrong. And so it's no surprise to me that Simon Peter, when he sees this happen, when he witnesses this miracle, he drops to his knees and he says, "Get away from me, I am a sinner." But here's what he's really saying there. What he's really saying is he's recognizing that Jesus is God, that Jesus is a holy man. And he's saying, I am a poor, downtrodden, lowly fisherman. I am a horrible person. You are a holy man. You should not be around me, because by being around me, you risk becoming more like me. You risk becoming a sinner. You risk much by associating with me. And what Jesus says next is astounding. He says, don't be afraid. Get up. Follow me. And so the fishermen leave the fish. They abandoned the first thing they gained, the fish, for the second, the epiphany. I can't tell you what Peter's hopes and dreams were when he was growing up, but this is Jesus calling him to follow a rabbi. The step of school that he was deemed too dumb to ever do. They were told they were not good enough, not smart enough, but we're nobody and we're good for nothing but the hardest, most menial work. But Jesus says, you are passed off for this. I want you to come follow me. I want you to come learn under me. Now, Jesus' apostles were not only made up of what would have been, frankly, the grossly unqualified for the job. At least one had a job that people hated, but some people wanted, and that was Levi, the tax collector. It's April 7th. You got about 8 days. I don't need to tell you why tax collectors weren't liked. But in addition to just collecting taxes, Levi was quite literally a thief and would have been considered a traitor. Because here's how the Roman tax system worked. They didn't say, all right, we're sending officials out to Jerusalem to collect taxes. No, they sent someone, and they would go into the community and they could say, who can gather us the most taxes? Tell me how much taxes you're going to get me. Not to random people. And they would put in bids. Oh, I'll get you this much. I'll get you this much. I'll get you this much. The person that gave the highest amount, they said, you're the tax collector. You get to go around with Roman soldiers and tell your countrymen to give you money. As long as we get as much money as you told us you're going to give us, we don't care what you do with the rest. It was very easy, and he probably did extort his neighbors. Levi would have been so hated as a tax collector that he would have been disqualified as a judge or a witness in court. His civic duties would have been stripped from him. He would no longer be allowed in the synagogue. His religious duties, his place in the religion would have been taken away from him. And he was even likely a disgrace to his family. In every way he could be connected to his Jewish heritage and his Jewish roots and his Jewish beliefs, he was cut off. But Jesus enters the tax office, and he immediately calls Levi, the tax collector, to come and be his apostle. There's no test with the fish. There's no great moment where Levi drops to his knees and says, I am a sinner and you are great. I love this picture I don't think you can see many of the details, but I picked this one because Jesus comes up and he's pointing, and Levi's like, me? And everyone else is looking at Jesus like, him? In all the images that I could find of Levi, or Matthew, as you may know him, there's always chaos going on around him. People are angry with him. People are throwing money at him. People are double-checking his counting. And Jesus comes in and calls him out of all that, out of all the people that are angry with him, that are upset with him, that feel cheated and betrayed. Matthew leaves everything behind. And remember, he could take whatever he wanted. He's likely very rich, very successful in business, but he leaves all of that behind to go and follow Jesus. He's so pleased to leave everything behind that he throws a party. Now, when you are disconnected from the community around you and you say, I'm going to throw a party, who gets invited to that party? The other outcasts, the other people that are disconnected. So this party is filled with tax collectors and sinners. It says Jesus is eating at a table with them. And you know who I bet's really surprised to hear they're going to this party? The other apostles. Because it's tax collectors and sinners. Sinners are one thing. Tax collectors are another thing. And yet they go. They go wondering what this means for them. Because when you eat with someone, you're closely associated with them. This was something families did together. This shows a certain intimacy with the people that you are eating and breaking bread with. That's why it's such a shock that Jesus would eat with them. The apostles, in going, follow Jesus into a place where they risk their own social standing. And yet, they humble themselves. They identify with the nobodies with Jesus. And then there are the people who don't want to identify with Jesus and don't want other people to identify with Jesus. The Pharisees and the scribes go up to him and they say, what, to Jesus' disciples, not to himself, but they say, why are you following this guy? He's eating with tax collectors and sinners. Is this really who you want to associate yourself with? Look at where he's leading you. Look at where he's taking you. Are you just like the tax collectors and sinners as well now? They're standing outside doing this, and I don't know how the disciples are answering this, but Jesus feels the need to step in when they sow discord and ask, why do you eat with tax collectors and sinners? I'm sure it was very uncomfortable. Jesus responds. He says, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick I have come to call not the righteous, but the unrighteous. He's come to call the unrighteous. The Pharisees followed Jesus around, so sure of their own ways and their own righteousness that they never saw who he was. This is significant because if anyone was going to wear a t-shirt that said, the coming Jewish Messiah is my homeboy, it's the scribes and the Pharisees. We can never forget that they are us. They are the church people. They never developed the humility needed to follow Jesus into the dirty, messy places. They were there with him, but Jesus didn't build the foundation of his church on them. I don't think that he could. Jesus works best with outcasts. Outcasts were his inner circle. They were his homeboys. He rarely ever met a church person who he could use until Saul. Let's talk about Saul for a moment. This is an image of the first time that we see Saul in Acts 7. He's executing Stephen, a Christian. You can skip to the next slide. That should not be there. Thank you. Now, Stephen is in this image, and he's kind of the central thing. He's what your eyes are supposed to go towards, but if you look in this lower left-hand corner, you see someone else that's also fairly well lit. Your eyes go up, but I want you to look down. The man with the coats piled at his feet. That's Saul. Now, as you read Acts 7, it kind of sounds like he's on the sidelines, like maybe, he's not the most important person. He's holding the coats. Like he's not actually doing this. But the imagery there suggests that Saul was the one in charge. He's holding the coats while everyone else does it because he's presiding over this. He calls himself a Pharisee of Pharisees. He says there was no one more zealous than himself in eradicating the heresy known as the Way and maintaining the purity of Judaism. Essentially, Saul's job, what he was passionate about, was eradicating this Jesus heresy that had cropped up. We don't get much. He was trained by the best. And he tells us, he was trained by Gamaliel, who was one of the most famous rabbis of the day, and he tells us, I followed every letter of the law. We don't get the rest of his story until Acts 9. He's on the road to a town called Damascus where he's gotten permission to root out the Jesus heresy there. When there's a brilliant flash of light, Saul was blinded and heard a voice say, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Saul asked a logical question. Who are you, Lord? And the reply came, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, but get up, enter the city, and you will be told what to do. Saul spends the next 3 days in the dark, eating and drinking nothing. We don't know much, but God tells Ananias, the person that comes to heal Saul, you'll find him here praying. He spends 3 days in the dark, hungry, parched, in prayer with God. I wish I had a record of what those prayers were. Of how God responded to all of Saul's questions. Because Saul goes in the Pharisee of Pharisees, but he comes out willing to take the gospel to the rest of the world. Going to the Gentiles, a group that as a Pharisee, if he followed on all the laws, he would not have associated with, he would not have eaten with, he would not have visited their house. This is a complete 180. And somewhere along the line, he changed his name to Paul. Why is it so hard for Jesus to get the attention of church people? And I want to say this, I get the hypocrisy of me getting up and saying this as a church person. Okay? So I just want to let you know, I do struggle with pride. I have pride in my knowledge. I sit down to read the Bible and I think, oh, I've read this story. I know this story. I've read this many times. But you know what I do then? I don't actually hear the story again. I just think about what comes next. I miss the details. I allow my mind to wander, and I miss the gifts that God has for me when I visit His Word. I have pride in my ability to speak. I'm not up here winging it. I prepare. I spend a lot of time preparing, but it does not matter how much time I spend preparing. I have come to realize that God will not give me the missing piece until Saturday night or Sunday morning. Because He doesn't want me to be able to say, look at what a great sermon I wrote, without Him reminding me of who it really is that needs to be communicating up here. God gets my attention and uses me as a flawed person in my flaws to say, I can cover up those flaws, but you need me, so that I give credit to Him. Paul becomes one of the greatest missionaries ever, and yet he still says, I have a thorn in my side. I have something that I cannot deal with that causes me constant pain, that God's grace helps get me through. Jesus found it easier to work with the nobodies. Peter never needed to be blinded. Matthew was already meeting with the outcasts. He didn't need to spend 3 days in darkness praying to know what God wanted him to do. But before God could be an apostle, before any of us can be God's servants, we need to be humbled. We have to become a nobody. This does not mean you become nothing. Paul's gifts and his passions were used. Paul knew several languages. He was a Roman citizen, which allowed him to travel freely. There are very funny stories where Paul is about to get flogged. And they said, can you flog a Roman citizen? And you can almost hear the centurion go, you didn't tell me that. He was going to get in trouble. He has a fantastic theological mind. He's literate, which was fairly rare, and he is able to write brilliant works of theology through his letters. Paul doesn't lose any of those things when he becomes a disciple of Christ. God uses those things in Paul. No, the nobody that you need to become is the type of nobody that looks at the stars and realizes how small they are on a clear night. That each star is a sun, and each sun is orbited by other planets, and that the galaxy is incredibly vast, vaster than I could ever imagine, and that my life is only a tiny speck in the vast billions of years history of the universe. And yet, God cares for me. And that the reason for all of that vastness and all of those years is so that Jesus can come and save humankind. As far as we know, we're it. Jesus does not leave Peter on his knees confessing his sins, or thinking he'll never amount to anything but a fisherman. He gives Peter the promotion that he never got. He does not leave Matthew to the company of sinners and tax collectors. He sees past Matthew's life as an outcast and gives him somewhere to belong. We see the opposite difficulty in the life of Paul, who's not needing to belong but has to give so much up. He would later recount all that he gave up. He was an influential Pharisee. He trained under the best teachers. He followed all the laws. He says that it was all nothing compared to what he gained in Christ. Nothing after his encounter with Christ. Finding our identity, whether it's in loss, in being worthless, in being the best, in being righteous, is nothing. It is just a t-shirt that we get to put on if we don't have a deeper identity rooted in Christ that says, I want to use the training from that past. The apostles don't work on paper. They are too diverse. They're too different. You have fishermen, the high school dropouts, a traitorous tax collector, a zealot protesting, maybe even killing people to try and overthrow Rome's power in Jerusalem. And eventually Paul, the self-righteous persecutor. What brings them together is that they take off these shirts, these temporary identities, and they meet together and they meet Jesus, who took off the identity of God so that he could come and wash their feet. We become a nobody so that God can make something out of us. And the importance isn't being something, the importance is following God. These can be useful identities, these temporary ones, but when they keep you from the work of Christ, they are the worst impediments. When they cause us to be uncomfortable among the poor, or those that follow a different political party, or those of a different race or a different orientation, these identities become impediments from sharing Christ and doing his work in the world. We have to be, like the apostles, willing to go eat with the sinners and the tax collectors, regardless of how that makes us look. Paul understands best what it's like to be a church person in this situation. He lists all those accolades again. Pharisee of Pharisees, greatest teacher, followed all the laws. It says this is all worthless. He says, I became all things to all people so that some might be saved. And it's important to note that this does not mean that Paul sinned to better relate to sinners, but that he recognized what part of his identity was a t-shirt that he can take off and go meet with people, and what part of his identity is rooted in his relationship with Christ. All the apostles here met Christ and changed. They changed the identities that were once at their core. Simon becomes Peter, the dropout who becomes the foundation of the church and one of its strongest leaders. Levi becomes Matthew, who wrote a gospel, and by the way, it's the gospel that most scholars agree was written to a Jewish audience. Matthew comes back around to the people that rejected him and writes what is now in our Bible, bringing them back to Christ. And of course, Saul becomes Paul, who brought the gospel to the people of the outside world, a people that all of his training and all of his traditions told him to reject. Because first they saw themselves as helpless nobodies that needed to be lifted up. They humbled themselves, allowed their identities to be questioned, and allowed God to work through that. Part of any church's mission is to help lead you and prepare you for an encounter like that. If you need perhaps healing or just this is difficult, we have a prayer team that would love to pray with you in the back. They would love to help you heal from loss or express your need from God. We take an offering, and you're just about to, and this offering, it helps fund the church's ministry, yes, but it's also a recognition that what we have here is temporary. That really God is in charge of all that we have. It's not ours, it's God's. God asks for 10%, and we recognize that's gracious because he could ask for all of it. We have ministries that tie us into the community and help us reach out, just as God reached out to us. We have worship, which helps tune our hearts to the praise of God, and that praise corrects our own pride, corrects where we want to be and our own station to remind us that we are insignificant except for what God can do through us. I'd like to pray for you now as a group, but if any of these things will help you reach that encounter with God, please seek them out. Make yourself a nobody so other people can begin to see God through you. Will you pray with me? Father, I love that line, to tune our hearts to sing your praise. When we tune our hearts, Lord, let it not just be about singing, but about our actions, about who we are. Lord, I pray first for myself and then the rest. If what we need is a harsh truth delivered to us in a way that we'll listen, help us listen. Help us to accept that. Father, if what we need is a gentle hand lifting us up, help us see it. Do not let us stay mired down in our own pain and our own suffering so that we miss the gift of your comfort and healing. Father, as we become less and less ourselves, we pray that we fill ourselves with more and more of you so that we can in turn fill others. It is in your name we pray. Amen.